Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Welcome to our Ritual Night Talk for September 28th. I'm Scott Stenwick, your host for these Ritual Night Talk events, presented under the auspices of Leaping Laughter OTO in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Before I get going, the YouTube spiel. I'm getting better at this, really. So like, subscribe, notifications if you like this video, and that way you won't miss any time that we go live with one of these events or rituals, which we sometimes do rituals in this Tuesday night slot as well, such as the Via Solis Elixir rites. I have a couple of links attached. First link is to the chart Victor calculation. Second link is to simple electional timing. Over the course of this talk, I will explain to you what those two things are. And third, I have the donation link. All donations help to support Leaping Laughter OTO in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and help us, keep the lights on, keep putting out presentations like this, keep doing the work that we're doing. So, with that, tonight I am going to be talking about astrological magic. I get a lot of questions about this because I do astrological rituals on here with the Elixir rites, and I have a bunch of material on my blog about astrological magic. And there isn't actually a lot of good stuff out there on astrological magic. Like if you go to an occult bookstore and you pick up something, you're maybe going to find, maybe one or two books that covers this topic. And, many of them aren't terribly good. The one that does have really good material in it, although I take issue with some aspects of the writing style, that's a whole other thing, is Estelle Daniels' Astrological Magic, which is available from Wiser. That does cover a number of things that are very important. Some of the electional stuff, the simple electional timing method I actually learned from Estelle Daniels. And so that material is very good. And if you can get through it, that's great. But aside from that book, okay, there really are not a lot of books out there that really just talk about, the mechanics of what you do for astrological magic. Ben Dykes has a book out. Ben Dykes is who I learned the chart Victor calculation from. That's the other article. He also has a book out in astrological magic, but it's very basic. It doesn't cover a lot of the depth of material. And there's, a few other things here and there that talk about it a little bit, but a little bit. Okay. And that's kind of the thing. So people, I think, who are doing magic, especially beginners, they don't get this idea that astrology really completely fits into magic, or why it's important or how it's important, stuff like that. So that is some of the material that I'm going to cover tonight. I'm going to talk about why it's that, why astrology, what's the effect that it has on your magic, why should you use these methods, and basically what you could do to employ these methods to optimize your results, because really that should be what we're all about, right? We optimize the results. We want to do the magic. We want it to work the best it possibly can. So backing up a little bit. Astrology has been part of magic from time immemorial. There's a quote that I was trying to find for this that I was unable to track down immediately in Agrippa, where he talks about the magician shall observe, and gives this long list of things. And they're all components that go into, or almost all of them are components that go into that chart Victor calculation, which again, I will get to in a minute. And so this concept of taking, various astrological dignities and forces and taking them into account goes back to, medieval magic at the very least. The chart Victor calculation is from Ibn Ezra, who was an Arabic astrologer, I believe, from the 1300s, I think, if I remember the date right. It's either 1200s or 1300s. And so, that predates, the Renaissance in Europe, which it predates, the Christian Kabbalah. You get Ficino, Mirandola, in the later 1400s and so on. And so this was stuff that went into the construction of magic. It was stuff magicians studied. Behind the three pillars of magic in the Western tradition are, magic, ceremonial ritual, alchemy, and astrology. Those are the three. So those three concepts put together, that's what Western magic basically is. So for people to neglect astrology, I think is kind of a short-sighted thing. And the thing is that people should understand it. Okay. And so the deal is that that astrology is like the weather into which you're casting your spells. And I think this is the basic concept that you need to get down. Okay. Because the thing is that you can cast a spell without paying any attention to astrology and you can get results. When I was starting out, I did that myself. I would look at things, basic stuff like, planetary hours and days. I did a lot of Enochian. Enochian doesn't have some of those considerations. It does have the days and the heptarchia and, possibly hours, depending on how you read it and so on. And the thing about it is that, you can get results. Cast a spell, you can send stuff out there, you can get results, and it will work once you get good at what you're doing. Okay? But there is a difference between casting a spell into the wind and casting a spell with the wind. And that is what I think people who ignore astrological considerations don't completely understand. I have seen various comments online, and I'm not going to name names because I don't necessarily have names, that there are people out there who are selling talismans commercially. And they really are not paying much attention to the astrology of when they're creating these things. So I've talked to a couple of people who went out and bought talismans from somebody who, was supposedly, a good talisman maker. And then they looked at, okay, well, here's the time it was created. They run it through, an astrology program. And there's all kinds of stuff that are contradictory to what the talisman is going to do. You've got, bad applying aspects. You've got squares. You got stuff all over the place. Basically, the talisman, it may have been made in the right day and hour, but without really paying attention to a bunch of these other considerations that affect how it works. And it's especially important when you are creating a talisman to employ astrological techniques, because a talisman locks in the spiritual weather at the moment of its creation. In other words, if you create, let's say, a Venus talisman, right, for love, okay? If you create that and Venus is in this fantastic position, and it's got like this great aspects applying to it and stuff like that, it's going to work better than if you just picked, a random time that was in the day and hour, on a random week. It will work better than, a situation in which, Venus is in a bad condition. I mean, if you make a Venus talisman and Venus is in a bad condition, it's not like the thing is going to reverse or work backwards or backfire or whatever, but it won't work well. Basically, the condition of the planet when you make the talisman, okay, that is encoded into the talisman at the moment of its creation. And so if you've got you've got a Venus talisman that's a badly aspected Venus talisman, and you have one that's a well-aspected Venus talisman, the well-aspected one basically is going to cast with the wind, and the poorly aspected one is always going to cast against the wind. And it doesn't matter what Venus does subsequently, okay? The talisman at the moment of its creation, that's the astrological weather that's locked in. It's like how the natal horoscope is, the moment of your birth. Same exact idea. Except with the talisman, you have a lot more options because you're picking when you're going to create it. So you can create a good election for it and build that into the talisman and then get an especially good talisman. It also has the bonus of, so you're going to conjure a spirit to help you with this talisman. The same election that's going to make the talisman work well is going to make, the spirit's power work better too. And so that those are two ways in which there's an effect. So there's this natal kind of effect of the talisman was born at this moment. And then you also have the effect of, you're conjuring a spirit, and that spirit picks up the power of that moment as well. And so it's kind of like a double whammy, it's like it can synergize, and you can get a talisman that can put out a lot more power than you would otherwise get, or that you would be likely to get picking dates and times fairly randomly. So that's why it's important to study this stuff. If you pick times randomly, sometimes you'll happen to get something with a good aspect. Sometimes you'll happen to get something with a bad aspect. And so what's going to happen is your talismans are going to be flakier, right? They're not going to, they'll work, but, well, sometimes I get one that's great, and sometimes I get one that's kind of And I mean, if you know what you're doing, even the talismans, even those can still be effective and get results, but they're always going to be pushing kind of uphill against that moment when they were created. So that's important. You want to understand that. And my suggestion would be, if you're going out to buy a talisman from someone, especially if you're going to spend a lot of money on it, ask them, what do they do as far as, astrological aspects and so on for the talisman? I mean, so talisman of a planet, what is the condition of the planet that you look for, when you're doing this? And if they come back and tell you, oh, that's not important, which I've heard stories, apparently some of them do, I wouldn't buy a talisman from that person. I think that you really behoove yourself that if you're going to spend the money, you should go ahead and, try to, get the best thing you possibly can for your money, right? And so that's going to be a talisman that is created at an appropriate zodiacal moment where the force that it represents, be it a planet or a sign, what you wind up with there is that you'll wind up getting a better talisman for what you want to do. And like I say, no, don't contact me to make you talismans. I don't do that. So anyway, so getting back to astrology. So the first concept I want to talk about is called the chart victor. Okay. And the deal with the chart victor is a medieval formula for calculating the strongest planet at a particular moment for a chart. So you can go through the article, and I'm not really going to go through, how to do the calculation. That's, it's a fairly involved process. And in the article, you can, walk through it and stuff like that. But the basic idea is you're taking the sign of the sun, you're taking the sign of the moon, you're taking the sign of the ascendant, you're taking the part of fortune, and you're taking the prenatal lunation. And what you're doing is depending on what signs those are in, you are assigning points on a grid to each of the planets. Then you take what house the planet is in. The different houses have different point values. And then finally, you're taking the day and the hour, and you get 6 points. You get 7 points for the day and 6 points for the hour. Okay. And finally, there is a method of the superiors where Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn can get some extra points depending on where they are in relation to the sun. And when you figure all that stuff out, you come up with a number at the end for each of these planets, and whichever planet has the highest number, that is the chart victor, which is also known as al-Mubtaz in the Arabic, which means the victor or the winner. And by the way, in astrology software, you can actually do this. The chart victor planet got corrupted into something called an al-Mutin in modern astrology software. It's a corruption of the Arabic al-Mubtaz. But it is the same thing. Okay. It might not include the method with the superiors, but the method with the superiors for Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn really only have an effect if the calculation is really close. Okay. So generally speaking, al-Mutin from a modern astrological software program is going to be something that you can work with as your chart victor for your operation. And so here's what you want in a chart victor. So ideally, if you are doing, let's go back to that Venus operation. Okay. If you're doing a Venus operation, ideally, you want Venus to be the ruling planet. You want it to be the chart victor. Okay. Because of what happens throughout the year, that's not always possible. It's usually substantially easier to get a chart victor of a particular planet when the sun is in a sign that it rules, because there's some issues there with the prenatal lunation and so forth. And it seems like, but we were doing these calculations for people, so you could do it for yourself too on your own natal chart. And the planet that comes back is supposed to be like a special connection to spirituality that is particularly related to you. So If your Al-Mubtaz comes back as Venus, it would be like methods associated with Venus would be particularly effective for you spiritually. So that's how it works on a person. Okay. In magic, it has to do with what is the strongest planet at the moment that you're sending your spell out or creating your talisman. Okay. So let's say, you're doing a Venus operation. All right. So Venus is the best. Okay. You definitely want, Venus is okay because Venus, Venus is the planet you are working with. Now, you can also get chart victors that are neutral, that aren't necessarily inimical to the planet that you're working with. But for example, you wouldn't want a Mars Mubtaz, right? Because a Mars chart victor would be that, the Mars chart victor would be, that would be inimical to Venus because Mars and Venus rule opposite signs. So Mars rules Aries, Venus rules Libra. And so the two planets are at odds with each other. Same is true with Scorpio and Taurus, Mars and Venus again. And so that is what you want to avoid. You want to try and make sure that you don't have an opposing planet to what you're trying to do. And so like if you were doing a Saturn operation, the signs Saturn rules are Capricorn and Aquarius. So you wouldn't want, for a Saturn operation, you would not want your Mubtaz to be the sun or the moon, which rule Leo and Cancer, which are the signs opposite Capricorn and Aquarius, and so on. I mean, you could look through the essential dignities to see what planet rules what. Basically, you don't want, planets are not really friends with each other if that planet is in detriment or in fall in the sign that is ruled by the planet you're working with. So you want to avoid that. Other planets are okay and they're neutral, and they won't necessarily interfere, but they're not going to amplify it the way Venus would either. Okay. Something similar can be done with astrological magic using signs. Okay. So if you were creating a talisman for one of the signs of the zodiac, you don't want to have a chart victor that is a planet that is in detriment or fall in the sign that you're working with. Okay. So for example, if you want to do a Taurus talisman, this is kind of an interesting one because Taurus is the secret of physical strength. It's the power of Taurus in Libra 777. But the planet that is in detriment in Taurus, though, is Mars. And so you might think, hey, I'm doing this Taurus operation for physical strength, right? And so Mars is my chart vector, and that's okay because, Mars is also strength. It's Geburah. You'd think there might be a connection, but there really isn't, and that won't work well. The reason it won't work well is because in the house of Taurus, Mars is in detriment, okay? And so that's what you're looking for there. You want to find something that will work well. Now, in Taurus is ruled by Venus, and the moon is exalted. So Venus would be a good chart victor for Taurus, and so would the moon because the moon is exalted there. You can kind of follow that around like Libra. Okay, so Venus is the ruler, Saturn is exalted. So Venus works of justice and equilibrium. Good chart victors would be Venus and Saturn. So let me see. I got a question here. Let's see. Worked with talismans to affect and filter astrological aspects and effects. So yes, I have to some degree. I don't know that I have a full experimental body of work that would specifically say, well, it's definitely this, like I do with some of the other technical stuff. But the thing is that the talisman is going to be bound by the electional timing. Okay. So one of the things that one of the other magicians I talked to about says on me for is so I have asthma, and I have this issue where Mars is in Sagittarius and it's opposing my moon and Mercury in Gemini. And he's like, oh yeah, that's like totally going to be like a health thing, right? And so you should do a talisman to counteract that Mars. Okay. And so, yes, if I were going to do that, I would want to make a Mars talisman, and I would want Mars to be as well aspected as possible. just like planets, okay? What's going on here is sphere of influence. So planets rule over the areas that they control. It's not like, Saturn like rules limitations and restrictions, but you can also use Saturn to speed stuff up because Saturn rules limitations, slowdowns, and restrictions. You could use it to change boundaries, expand boundaries. So you could basically use all of the planets and all of the signs in both a positive and a negative way. So even though Saturn and Mars are generally considered malefics, the deal is that you still want them to be able to control and function with what you're trying to do with them. Okay. So actually, I would not want a talisman where Mars would be badly aspected to reduce the effect of Mars. I would want it to be well aspected. And so the Mars that's linked to the talisman, so that aspect is really powerful. And then in your charge, you specify, counteract this effect of Mars in this house, in this placement, and bind and create the talisman that way. Okay. So that's the deal. And that's something that also it took me years to figure out was the sphere of influence thing. That's part of the reason I talk about it so much. And the thing is that, I for a long time, I would do stuff like, I'll speed stuff up by conjuring Jupiter. I'll slow stuff down by conjuring Saturn. And I hadn't completely figured out, well, actually, no, Saturn actually rules that timing. That's why, Kronos, the god of time, is associated with Saturn and this kind of thing. So Saturn can speed up or slow down. Jupiter can expand things, but can also limit expansion. Jupiter is political and other ascendancy. But you know what? If you've got a politician you don't like, you want to curse them with losing an election, don't throw Saturn at them. Use Jupiter. Jupiter rules political and other ascendancy and say, call on the spirits of Jupiter to curse that politician to lose that election. Because again, sphere of influence. Mercury, you can conjure Mercury to make somebody stupid. I'm not sure why you would want to do that, but Mercury is, knowledge of sciences and gifts of tongues and stuff like that. So, if you want to make your communication better, that's awesome. Okay. And Mercury works great for that, but you can also mess up communication too. Or, okay, let's say, there was something where, you were trying to slow walk, I don't know, maybe some legal process or something. And okay, you had to respond by a certain date. So, okay, so you put the letter in the mail and you want to take as long as possible to get there. That's an application for Mercury. It's not Saturn. It's Mercury because Mercury rules communication. So Mercury can mess up communication or make it better. So basically that's the big thing to keep in mind, sphere of influence when you're doing work like that. Because, you want the talisman that is working with aspect either to increase it or decrease it, to have that energy in the talisman as well aspected as possible for the planet that you're trying to influence or the sign. So the next thing I'm going to touch on is this idea of electional timing. Okay, and so electional astrology is slightly different from natal astrology in a couple of key ways. So the main key way when you're looking at electional timing for something is you are specifically looking at what are called applying aspects. Okay, so you can have two planets on a chart that could be conjunct, as in they're close enough together that they're within orbs, so they're considered conjunct. But in electional astrology, when you've got an aspect moving like this, so approaching, the aspect hits, and then it moves past. Okay, in a natal chart, it's still in a conjunction at this point. Okay, but this is now a separating aspect. It's moving away from the other planet. So this is separating. In electional astrology, we do not count those. L. Daniels put it with electional aspects. It's you either catch the bus or you miss the bus. It's like you have to be there, right before it happens, or at the very latest when it happens. Because if you're even a little bit past, you missed the bus, and you can't pick it up anymore. So that's one big difference. And actually, it's a pretty big difference. If you start taking a look at charts that you run for things, you're like, all right, so it helps to have, something like an animate function. Like, and I've got that in my Astrolog, my completely, old astrology software that I use. And I'm assuming that, modern, really nice astrology packages, if you get those, have that function too. So you want to take the moment, and then you want to animate it forward from that time and make sure that if you're working on a conjunct aspect, it's doing this and it's not doing this. Because if you get a snapshot, it can be hard to tell, because planets sometimes have retrograde motion. It has to do with when the aspect is approaching. That's the key. And so you want to get the you want to catch that bus if there's an aspect that you want. And if that means you need to move the ritual over a little bit or whatnot, or adjust it, it's important. Another thing to keep in mind with rituals, and this is true for both the creation of talismans and just for casting direct zodiacal spells, is the moment that you start the ritual is the moment that you use for figuring out these aspects. Okay. So if you had a thing where, if you have a ceremonial ritual that is, this or that length, okay, what's going to happen is that, if you're even like, it's like, oh, I've got 1 minute to go. You just like start your ritual right then. You've started your ritual. Okay. And just like from the first, lesser pentagram or whatever you open with, you've started your ritual. And now that's the aspect that you've got. That works for planetary hours too. You don't have to do your ritual within the planetary hour. You just have to catch the planetary hour. So even if you started a ritual for a planet, in the last like 2 minutes, okay, of the planetary hour, you're still catching the planetary hour as long as you do the ritual at that point, as long as you start the ritual at that point. And so that can be very helpful for moving things around. Like, okay, so you want to catch this electional aspect, but you still want to get the hour. So sometimes you wind up with this thing where you're stuck like in the last, few minutes of a planetary hour, but it's that start time that is the key. And so that's helpful. It's like, otherwise, well, if it had to all be done within the hour and then the aspect is like way at the end of the hour, there wouldn't be a way to do that very effectively. The aspect would still be applying, so you could do that. But the other thing is the closer it is, as it applies, the better it is. And then it's like, once it's passed, oh, you missed the bus. So that's how you want to think about it. And that can get pretty complicated when you're going through and you're looking at, all these different planets and aspects and stuff. At the very least, you want to look at aspects to the planet that you're working with, or things that are happening in the sign that you're working with. In all those cases, if you're looking at the sign, you want to look at the condition of the ruling planet of the sign, where it's located, and so on. And so all of that can get kind of complicated. Electional astrology is its own whole discipline of astrology. And, maybe you don't want to sit down and do all of those calculations for something that you're trying to figure out. Now, you should take a look, though, and, just make sure that there isn't anything like really catastrophic, like this thing of Saturn applying in a square to, to something that's supposed to be like love or prosperity or something like that. Even though like Saturn and Venus get along, Saturn and a Venus talisman really isn't ideal. And so you want to make sure there isn't some really like messed up thing with the planet or with the planet ruling the sign that you're trying to deal with. You just want to make a basic check of that. And there's a whole lot of other things to take into account. But there is a simple method of doing electional timing, which I talk about on my blog, which is the simple electional timing article. And how the simple electional timing works is you want to look at what's called the moon's final aspect. Okay. So, and there are places online like Lunarium is a website, Lunarium Co. UK. You can look that stuff up. And there's other places you could find it too. Any place that has an ephemeris, you can read through it and see what's going on there. So the deal with the moon's final aspect is the moon makes a complete circle of the zodiac over its 28-day cycle. And so it moves into a sign, and then it makes aspects with things in that sign, and then it moves into the next sign. Now, the final aspect is the last aspect the moon makes in the sign. So let's say that, say the moon, let's say it's in Aries, and it's working its way through Aries, and a little bit before it goes into Taurus, it's going to make a trine with, well, anything. Okay. Let's say that it's, let's just say that it's Venus. We'll go back to Venus. So you got a moon trine Venus. Okay. If that's your final aspect, that's a positive aspect. And with a positive aspect like that, your ritual is going to work better. Okay. So the positive aspects are squares. Squares negative. Okay. Let's start with the negative aspects are squares and oppositions. Okay. Positive aspects are conjunctions, trines, and sextiles. So if those are the other like sub aspects aren't really considered for this. So if you're finding that you check it, moon's final aspect and the sign it's currently in is like, say, moon opposing Mars. Okay. Well, that's an opposition. That's not astrological weather. When the moon's final aspect is positive, the astrological weather is good. When the moon's final aspect is negative, the astrological weather is bad. Okay. And so if you could figure that out for the moment that you're doing the spell, and or, time your spell so that it is when the moon is in a sign in which its final aspect is positive, you're going to get a better result. Okay. And if it's negative, you're not going to get as good a result. Generally speaking, bad final aspects I try to avoid. It is also true that there is kind of an internal externality polarity to that too. So even with a negative final aspect, sometimes you could do things like insight or whatnot, but it's not good for practical magic. It's like you're going to throw that, and the probability shift is going to be impeded by that astrological weather. Okay. The other thing that you want to keep in mind is what's called a void of course moon. Okay, and I've seen some arguments online. Is the void of course moon important? Well, the void of course moon does affect talismans, and it does affect spells in my experience. And so you should pay attention to them. Ideally, you don't really want to do a spell on a void of course moon. Okay, here's what a void of course moon is. So let's go back to our example. We got the moon, it's in Aries. It's going through here, and it's going to make this positive aspect, trine Venus. And that's the last aspect it makes in the sign Aries. Well, once it passes that aspect, it's still in Aries for a little while, but it doesn't have any more aspects in the sign to make. And that's called void of course. Okay. So basically, it's like the tail end of each sign that the moon is in after it's made the last aspect that it's going to make in that sign. Then once it flips over to the next sign, it starts working on the first aspect in that sign and so on. And when it hits the final aspect, again, right at the moment it hits, either are on the bus or off the bus. Right at the moment it hits, it goes void of course right afterwards until it hits the next sign. And I recommend that you avoid doing magical operations when the moon is void of course. Now, there is a little advantage that you could take of the void of course moon, but not by doing spells like during it. Okay. If you made a talisman or cast a spell to affect something that was going to be happening on a void of course moon. Okay. So I'm going to, I've got this spell I'm going to cast, and I don't know what am I trying to do with this spell? Let's say that, let's say that I'm trying to cast something where, I want to, there's some financial situation, and, I'm in competition with somebody, and, I want to win out in the situation. Okay. I could take advantage of that trine aspect in Aries. Okay. Especially if the actual event that it needed to influence was after that during the void of course moon or during a subsequent void of course moon. The thing about a void of course moon is that, well, if you cast a talisman to create an effect, right? Okay, well, that effect is going to endure whether or not the moon is void of course, because it locks in the power of the moment that it was created. And that is what it brings to bear in accomplishing the task it's charged to accomplish. But when the moon goes void of course, those influences are difficult to resist or stand against. Estelle Daniels has a story about Ronald Reagan, who used astrology. Okay, actually, it wasn't Ronald. It was actually Nancy. And Nancy, I believe it was Jean Dixon was her astrologer. And, she was like in the tabloids and stuff. And no, but Nancy Reagan was like a huge believer in astrology. And one of the things, if you look at during the Reagan administration, there would be these things where, there would be like a press conference that would happen. And he'd be like super late. He'd show up, like 20, 25 minutes late to this conference. It's supposed to start at 8. Okay. And so And so Estella at one point was working somewhere like in the like at a TV station or in the media or something like that. And what she noticed was, wait a minute. Every time Reagan had something bad that he needed to tell people, like with the Iran-Contra thing or stuff like that. Anytime he had to deliver bad news, what would happen is he would be late to the conference, and he would show up like a minute or two after the moon went void of course. So presumably Nancy was saying, no, you got to wait, go out like now. And so what he would be doing is he would be delivering this bad news to the American people, but he'd be doing it on a void of course moon. And so he never really got the kind of blowback from it that other presidents might have, because he was real disciplined about doing this. And so if you have to deliver bad news to someone, that is a good thing to do. Use a void moon, because what's going to happen is that, you could deliver bad news to somebody, but it's not really going to stick to you. And it's just going to be, it's like the idea is on a void moon, there isn't really any force there to stand against what you're doing. And so, I mean, I just think that's fascinating looking at, Reagan was a Teflon president. Oh, all these things happened, but nothing ever stuck to him. Nothing ever stuck to him because he was using astrology. Nancy was telling him, when to go out and talk. And it was always when the moon went void of course, when he wanted to communicate something that, could be a problem for his administration. So definitely, so this method definitely works. And it works on talismans too. It's like and it works on spells. So you don't want to be casting on a void moon because there isn't a lot of force to do anything with. But, but if you cast, in a strong astrological position, you're trying to influence something during a void moon, there isn't going to be much defense against what you're creating. And so that's another fun little optimization there to help make that work. So I invite you to take a look at some of that stuff. I invite you to join us for our Zodiacal Elixir rites that we do here Tuesday nights. I go through one of those every month for the sign of the zodiac in which the sun is in, and it's a cool ritual. You can participate to the extent that you can online, and you can get a good grasp of how somebody just like puts together an astrological ritual by watching these ones that I do. I don't know if there are a lot of other sources out there who are really even doing things that similar to it. So it's a very cool method, and stay tuned to this video series, and you'll be able to check a few out. If you want to go into our YouTube channel, you can look back, and we have some of the historical ones there that you can view. And so with that, I think I'm going to wrap it up for tonight. Just the key takeaways are, if somebody is a magician, especially if you're going to pay them to do work, and they're going to say, oh, the astrology is not important, don't pay them to do the work. I'm serious. They should at least have a basic understanding of, okay, well, I got to look through this and make sure this at least looks kind of good. They don't have to be, fantastic electional astrologer, but, they shouldn't be making talismans that have, like all kind of for a planet that has has all these applying squares and stuff like that. That's not good. You're going to get a talisman that, you paid money for, and it's not going to work very well. Second of all, you should take a look at these concepts and integrate them into your work. You can get results without them. It's not one of these things where, you don't get any magical results if you don't pay attention to astrology. But your magic will work so much better if you do. Now, let me actually just add one more thing here, which is sometimes you just need to do something and you need to pick the best aspect you can, and that's okay. There are periods, actually, the last few months, the astrology has been, kind of a crap sack for a lot of stuff. I've heard that from a couple of people. And so there are periods like that, and you still need to do magic. And, the point is not that, you need to rigorously conform to all these things and make sure there's nothing negative or anything like that. Probably there's going to be something negative in any chart that you do. The point is to do your best to pick the best one you can find. Okay. And the simple electional timing method, that can be used on its own. If you don't want to go into calculating chart victors and stuff like that, take a look at the moon's final aspect. The moon's final aspect is helpful. And it's going to be especially helpful if it's aspecting a planet that's harmonious with the planet or the sign that you're trying to work with. So that's a thing to keep in mind. And avoid working on void moons if you can at all do that. You want to be working at a time when the astrological energy is like on and flowing. And a void moon, the moon is the final dispositor of astrological energy. And what happens is during that void of course period, that energy is kind of petered out. So anyway, with that, I'm going to sign off for tonight. Thanks for watching. Hope you learned something, and I hope that you learned something here, especially that you could take back to your own practice and integrate. Take a look at the articles. They're linked in the description of the video. You can also search for them on my blog. I'll go IDs, the chart vector calculation, and simple electional timing. And with that, thank you all very much for watching tonight, and have a great rest of the evening. Love is the law, love and will.